Patience. Mm. Something like the fellow in the dentist chair, and they're getting a tooth pulled, and they've been dead pill and discussed. You pulled out the wrong tooth. He said, patience, I'm coming to it. So, the next fruit of the Spirit, as Paul mentions there in Galatians, patience. The word tends to be most of the understanding of steadfastness. Whenever I mentioned the last talk about Jesus turning his face steadfastly towards Jerusalem. And it's that sense there about patience. As I said, there's a number of synonyms go with these fruits, and it's not just one thing particularly describes it, often it's several. It's often described too as long suffering, endurance, and fortitude. All these ideas come into this particular fruit here of patience. And it points to the perseverance, for example, in listening to others. Sometimes, often, you're listening to someone who's got, and you feel like immediately jumping into there, what you think is the answer, on short-circuit the process. In good intentions to help, but it's often a case where it works against rather helping. Like the woman on the phone to someone whereby the other went on and on in a long rambling monologue. You've ever had that sort of situation. And then finally the person who's doing this long rambling monologue says, well, it's been good to have this discussion with you. And dialogue. And the person says, dialogue? I haven't been able to get a word in edgeways. It's often that sense here that, so it's this quality of staying with people even when they constantly wrong or irritate us by their actions. It's that kind of perseverance. Down in the diocese of Dunedin, where I am, there's one particular priest, and he has, I think, amazing patience and perseverance. He was involved in prison chaplain ministry for many years, and even though he's retired, he still does this work. Especially a number of these men who he meets for being out of jail, but are always living on the fringe, if no one. And he gets them together, and he looks out. He often helps feed them and gives them counsel and advice and helps them in different ways. But so often, time and time again, they let him down. They promise him this, and they never come to the party. And we often say to him, how long are you going to persevere with them? But he never gives up on them. It's amazing. Like he was turning on a Christmas party for them, because none of them have anywhere to go for Christmas. And in preparation for the thing, he asked one of them, and he gave them some money to go and buy the food. Well, he realised that was a mistake. And he ended up going across the bar, and he met the fellow later, and he was in a bit of an alcoholic stupor. No food, nothing, everything. But he never gives up on it. And we often say to him, why, what's this, why do you do this? Well, he said, Jesus and the poor and the needy. But it's often where they consistently let him down. But he never gives up on it. So it's this kind of steadfastness or perseverance here that is, often where we'd after several times think, oh, this is a pretty worth. And yet, it's this sense here, I think, too. I remember, have any of you ever heard Timothy Radcliffe, the Dominican speaker? He's often very interesting, Tim, and he talks about, he was there the Dominican visitator of their order of the world, and he used to, like their superior, he used to go around and visit, and go see how things were going. He told us once he went to Paris, it was near Christmas, and with the conquerors there, one of the priests there used to go out and do this street work, like helping out alcoholics and drug addicts and all sorts of people who were unable to look out, well, were in desperate situations. And he offered this priest would come home to the congregation house once a week or once a fortnight or something, just to wash up, with their have a shower, tidy up with all the work he was doing. Anyway, while he was there, it was near Christmas, and he told Tim Radcliffe, he said, we're having a big Christmas mass, so going to have it somewhere at a big marquee. And he said, would you like to come and join us? So Tim said, yeah, all right, I'll come. So yeah, there they were at this midnight mass somewhere in Paris, and this big marquee. And all these street people, there were alcoholics and drug addicts and all sorts of big, prostitutes, all various kinds of people gathered for them. And Tim said that when the priest came to the offering of the gifts, he pulled the cork out of the wine bottle. All the alcoholics cheered. It was kind of very symbolic, but sort of time, that he gave us sort of this sense of that it was this man's perseverance with all these people that, he never gave up on them, So often, as I said, they could let you down so many times, but he said they never gave up. And I think this sense of perseverance and patience and steadfastness in the New Testament, it's often too where Paul talks about, say, the patience, endurance of wrong without anger or taking vengeance. And he mentions this in 2 Corinthians 6:6. I think we're looking at that area just before last talk. But he says there, he's talking about the labors, sleepless nights, by purity, knowledge, and patience, kindness, of that kind of perseverance, in spite of all that they were going through. Again, in Colossians, he mentions in 1:11 there, he says, may you be made strong with all the strength that comes from his glorious power. And may you be prepared to endure everything with patience, while joyfully giving thanks to the Father who has enabled you to share in the inheritance of the saints. So he said, persevering in it, but also joyfully giving thanks to the Father. So he links in the two there. As I said, notice how love these fruits mesh in with one another. And again in Timothy 3:10. So it's that sense too, that steadfastness and patience and perseverance in forgiving wrongs of others and also building up the community. I think it's especially given our society in Australia and New Zealand, where I know over our way there's very much a sense now for crimes in the community of this sense of revenge, There are often some of these terrible crimes. I'll come back to this when I speak aloud, and they say, look, lock these people up and throw away the key. I was reading the case here in Australia, took this morning about this couple who, I think in regard to their little baby, an autistic child, it's a terrible, the great read. I mean, it often makes you physically sick just reading. Now, we've had this situation in New Zealand too, and I think far more in a sense, because in fact, I often don't think they know what to do with the legal system in regards to our place. It's quite medieval, I think. But this sense of revenge, and recently we bishops in New Zealand published a statement on, it's called Revenge or Reconciliation, because we're at the situation now that after America, New Zealand has the highest incarceration rate in the world. I don't know where Australia is on it, but I'm not sure if you might be that far behind us. But we're number 2 now after America. It's a statistic you don't want to know about. Anyway, what we said is, as Catholics, we do not discount the terrible reality of the harm caused by criminal offending. But at the same time, we know that God's love does not give up on anyone. Here's this sort of perseverance and patience. In Pope John Paul II's message for the Jubilee in prisons, he reminded us that prisons can be places of redemption, and that not to promote the interests of prisoners would be to make imprisonment a mere act of vengeance on the part of society, provoking only hatred in the prisoners themselves. God calls even the worst of offenders to change and offers healing to those victims of crime able to find the courage to forgive. In 1989, the New Zealand Catholic bishops called our penal system a poison in the bloodstream of our nation, and predicted that unless we changed our ways of responding to crime, we were heading to become the most imprisoned society of the Western world. 20 years later, we have reached the number 2 position, second only to the United States. Prison numbers are growing faster than we can build prisons to hold people, and shortage of cells leading to unsatisfactory solutions such as double bunking. There's a new prison in Dunedin Diocese, and already it's overcrowded, and they're building these cells with double bunks, So it's really getting, but it's this sense here of having the wrong understanding of what we can do for people. We conclude the letter by saying all of us, whether victims of crime, offenders, employees in the criminal justice system, family members or neighbours, are called to find paths to a justice system which reconciles, which rejects attitudes of revenge, which helps victims to heal and offenders to turn their lives around. It is the only true path for the security and safety that a society longs for. So I'm not sure exactly what the situation in Australia is, but that's the sort of sense that that's where we are. I just mentioned that because it's saying here about having the patience and this perseverance to find the right way of getting rid of the poison in the system of the perpetrators and get rid of the poisonous system of those who are the victims. Coming back to the whole understanding of this fruit of the Spirit, as Tim George, a theological writer on Galatians, says, he says, this patience is preeminently a characteristic of God, who is long-suffering with his rebellious creature. He is the loving Lord who, in the face of obstinate infidelity and repeated rejection, still says to his people, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? We have that in Hosea 11:8. Paul makes the same point, and for himself, he who was a persecutor of the church. Now, Paul often mentions this. He talks about the persevering love of God. He quotes himself as a prime example because he says, here am I was a persecutor of the church. But look at what God's love and forgiveness has done for me. And he says, you want to look at an example of God's perseverance and long-suffering and patience. He said, I'm a prime example. He said God's patience, love has restored him. And he tells Timothy that Paul, talks himself as the foremost of sinners, but that I received mercy, that Jesus Christ might display his perfect patience, an example to those who were to believe in him for eternal life. He's saying, do you want to think about the perfect patience of Jesus Christ? Look at me. He says, I'm an example of those who've been forgiven and restored. And again, he mentions in 2 Timothy 4:2, his injunction there, exhorts them to preach the word in season and out of season, and to do it with great patience. It's again the sense of never giving up. And in Jesus, of course, we see this constant and unswerving patience and long-suffering. First of all, it's his patience, his perseverance. But even with his training of the apostles, at times he must have thought, it's just not getting through to them. Many times you think, things are not going too well at all. Must have been tempted to think, I wonder if I should, is there a plan B here, And so if any of you are ever discouraged about, catechizing or doing REs, don't ever give up on it, because think of Jesus as an example. You could say that Jesus' first communion class went astray, when, the miracle of the loaves and fishes. Then he said, now I'm going to talk to you about a phrase, about myself as the food for nourishment, mate. Don't bring others forward for you, And then look out there, he said to Peter, are you going to go up too? And on many other occasions where, things weren't going through, or getting through, that's when they seem to get the message. Then suddenly they drop a 20, or Susie Peter does that. He thinks, oh, we've missed it again. In fact, Mark's Gospel is a good example of that. Mark's Gospel, I remember in scripture class that their scripture lecturer, he said, it's like a passion narrative with a long introduction. And the critical part is where it's like when finally Peter makes the confession of faith. He says, who do people say that I am? And Peter said, you are the Christ of God. You are the anointed one of God. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Peter. And then almost immediately it switches into the passion. It's right, finally they've made the act of faith. Now they can move. It can move into the passion and resurrection. So it's like he concentrates on them. At the start of Mark's Gospel, he's very popular with the people. But gradually, when he asks them, the people, they start drifting away. They're happy to come and be healed and all, receive something. But when Jesus asks them to do something, they start drifting away. And he concentrates, as it were, on the 12. And finally, when they make the act of faith, you move into the passion and death, the resurrection scene. So it's that sense here, but it's this sense of the perseverance. It's a bit like the story of the man. There's the ring on the doorbell, and the fellow opens the door, and this man walks in, and this great big dog follows him in, and the dog that jumps all over the new carpets, with the muddy feet, and the guy looks at amazement, tears into the lounge, jumps up on the new drapes and brings them crashing down, and the fellow's looking stunned, and then he jumps up on the new table, scatters the candelabra, and then brings the light show net crashing down, and finally, in frustration, the man said, can't you do something about controlling your dog? And if the fellow said, my dog? He said, I thought it was your dog. So, but it's this kind of patience, of course, that we think about that the long-term understanding of, and he was patient for so long until finally he couldn't take any more. But it's this sense here of perseverance that is the critical point about this whole thing about patience. The sense of in the gospel where Jesus, like in some of the parables, like the parable of the sower and the seed, talking about the seed that dies, it's like that. He says that the farmer has to be patient until the seed finally grows and produces the fruit. And of course, in the early church, when they were suffering persecution and setbacks, and It must have been very difficult to keep persevering and patient. I think patience is one of the great virtues of our faith. But I think for many people it has a rather passive ring about. While we define it as endurance, it doesn't mean to sort of as though we sit down and accept things as they are. It doesn't mean it's sort of that weary sort of patience which just sits with bowed heads and folded hands and minds resigned and, often you read the newspaper, you watch the news and you think it's all got the series of disasters at times, isn't it? In fact, the only good news seems to be with sports news, and that could be bad news too. And even the forecast, I thought, that good, but then they talked about some more sandstorms coming to, things like that. You think, is it this sort of sense of just saying, oh, well, I've just got to be resigned to it, let the tide of things flow on, and think, well, what can I do? That often leads to that kind of situation. This is not the patience that the gospel or St. Paul is speaking about. And as I said, the example of the planting of a seed means often to calmly endure suffering or the hardships of life, that it seeks then to turn that around, to bring out the growth. And when we look at history, I mean, it's a lesson in human history as well. The understanding of often many of the great works of art, many of the great discoveries, many of the great inventions, while there was the spark of inspiration in people, it was often the perseverance and patience that brought about the triumph of whatever it is they were doing. Who was it said that genius was 5% inspiration and 95% perspiration? In other words, the whole sense of hanging in there. Was it Edison that somebody said that of all his great inventions, he'd also, someone said that there's about 20,000 things you had a go at and they didn't work. We said, yeah, okay, well, we know there's 20,000 things that don't work, but you keep trying. It never sort of deterred. Walt Disney was fired by a newspaper because he had no good ideas, he was told. He went broke 7 times and had a nervous breakdown before finally becoming successful. We've all seen all the products of his imagination, haven't we, in films and that. Wilma Randolph won 3 gold medals at the Roman Olympics in 1960. As a child, she had polio and was even lucky to walk. Think of the old Boris Gump film. Michelangelo took 8 years of unremitting toil to complete his Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, while Leonardo da Vinci took 10 years to complete his Last Supper. Edward Gibbon apparently took 26 years to write his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Noah Webster, of Webster Dictionary, took 36 years in compiling it. Adam Clarke, 40 years on a Bible commentary. Thomas Gray's elegy, written in a country churchyard, which we all had learned at school, went through something like 75 drafts, while Ernest Hemingway's Old Man of the Sea went through something like 80 drafts. George Stephenson took 15 years to perfect the locomotive, while James Watt took 30 years on inventing and improving the separate condenser steam engine. George Westinghouse was thought a lunatic by some railroad executives for persevering with the idea to stock a train by wind and air brakes. Which will be thanked partly. Charles Goodyear was in debt, but he toiled for years to give us vulcanized rubber. All these people never gave up. If they hadn't persevered, we would never have had all the works of art and inventions that they, by their lives, persisted in. Once Winston Churchill gave an end-of-year address to the school he had once attended. When he got up and spoke, he said, "Boys, never give up, never give up, never give up." And then he sat down. That was his speech. So when we look at all these examples of history and these people who persevered and had that steadfastness and believing what they were doing, I think it brings us back again, just give us this understanding of what this great fruit of the Spirit, this perseverance and patience and long suffering, and all that understanding can do in regard to living this beautiful fruit. Ignaz Paderewski, the great pianist, was asked why he spent such long hours at the keyboard once he had attained fame. And his answer was, if I don't practice for a day, he said, I notice it. If I don't practice for 2 days, my colleagues notice it. And if I don't practice for 3 days, everybody notices it. So it's this sort of sense, like often there's the inspiration, but the basic thing about it is, of course, is the perspiration or the perseverance in it, that this fruit of the Spirit is such a good example. So patience then, this lovely fruit that we are looking at, and this endurance and understanding, I think looking at it is the sense where it's patience to master things, it's determination, unhurrying yet undelaying, which steadfastly goes on and refuses to be deflected. It never halts or discouragement, or opposition from within or without. It was this patience and steadfast endurance we see in Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews in 12:2, where it spoke of Jesus enjoying the cross, and it's like I mentioned about Luke, his steadfastness, we're going to the cross, but this sense of enduring the cross. Patience then is this brave and courageous acceptance of everything that life can throw at us and transforming the worst events into another state of glory. We talk about the patience of Job. It doesn't mean that Job accepted his dreadful lot and signed and broken, because he fiercely questioned, struggled, and fought, and in that deepened his faith in this tortured crucible of steadfastness and pain. I think it's that understanding here that so often we can miss this particular point in regard to perseverance. In the early church, the thing that amazed the pagans in the centuries of persecution was that the martyrs didn't die grimly, but died singing. It's that joy we were talking about last night. And, by persevering to death and doing it with singing as they went to the Colosseum to suffer death. No wonder that St. John Chrysostom called patience the queen of virtues, and the Dutch Catechism called patience one of the loveliest virtues of our time. Often when we look about it, we might think, well, what's so lovely about it? This sort of sense of steadfastness and long suffering. But often when we look at it, we see the very point about it is that it's patience, is the endurance, it's with steadfastness which can face any situation, how bad it is, and turn it around to good. Patience is the endurance that gets a mother or father out of bed to tend a sick child. And steadfastness sees this happen not once, but on many nights through many years. Again, coming back to what I was saying this morning about fidelity in a way, and you see how again they interlock and mesh together. Patience is enduring defeat and steadfastly refusing to lie down. Patience is enduring when we want to quit, and steadfastness keeps us going. Patience is enduring, for example, unemployment, but steadfastness keeps us making another job application. Patience is enduring problems in our vocation, but steadfastly keeps us coping. Patience is enduring the God's plan and steadfastly promoting. Patience is enduring death to steadfastly win life. Patience is Christ enduring death on a cross to steadfastly win the victory. Patience is enduring deeper participation in the Eucharist and the sacraments to steadfastly live a better Christian life. To be patient is to be like Jesus, who did all things well and steadfastly so. He endured all to do the Father's will. As I said, his face was turned steadfastly towards Jerusalem and the cross that lay ahead. It's that sense here when I think of this great virtue, as I said, John Chrysostom speaks about, that makes us realize what a great of the Spirit this really is. This kind of persistence in the good times and in the bad. I often think it's a bit like the down our way in Geneva, we have a Cadbury's chocolate factory. You know, they make chocolates and biscuits and all that stuff. I'm not that a fan of the sweets. If they driving past it, I know this sickly smell chocolate Anyway, this girl applied for a job at the factory, and the boss said, he took her out onto the assembly line. He said, now, your job, he said, see that assembly line going along with all the biscuits on? He said, your job is to take off the broken ones. They did. At the end of the day, she came and said, I can't go on with this job. And he said, what's so difficult about it, you know? Oh, she said, it's awful, she said. All day long, it's decisions. So she wasn't showing what we say the virtues of steadfastness or long suffering, but it was this sense here, I think, really, that how many of our works in life are often tied up with perseverance, long suffering, endurance, and patience. All these things are really, if you like, part and parcel of the same lovely fruit of the Spirit. This one that Paul says he was such an example of. And he's saying, in fact, that as God is long-suffering and patient with each of us, we too should be long-suffering, patient, and persevering with one another. Thank